Hi from Detroit, everybody. I'm sorry this is so late. My flight got in late, and yeah. But anyway, I did want to talk, as promised, about Elizabeth Barrett Browning and factory children, and to respond to the few flips that I've already gotten. Hopefully, give you some more context for those of you who haven't done your flips yet. So, yeah. All right. So, which some people think might have been tuberculosis. She took laudanum for the pain, from a very early age, which also, being a form of opium that we've talked about, might have contributed to her really poor health. When she was a young adult, and actually till the age of 40, she spent a lot of her time in her room upstairs at Wimpole Street, which I'm going to talk about in the next slide. In terms of her writing, she campaigned for the abolition of slavery. Her work, like the poem we read for today, helped influence reform in child labor. And she was actually a candidate to Alfred Lord Tennyson for Poet Laureate after Wordsworth died, because her poetry was that prolific and that popular. So that actually says a lot about her as a woman writer, right? And sort of how influential she was able to become. So Elizabeth Barrett Browning is very well known for her sonnets to the Portuguese, most famously How Do I Love Thee, Let Me Count the Ways, which she wrote to her husband, also a poet, Robert Browning. So I have a video about that. Again, some of this narration is not perfect, but it is useful in terms of you can sort of see some of the places where the Brownings lived. Yeah. So I'm going to play this for you. Hopefully. Yes.
One of the greatest love stories in all of British literature is that of Robert Browning and Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who lived in a house on this site. Elizabeth Barrett was an invalid most of her life. She was the daughter of a pathologically overprotective father. He didn't want any of his children to marry. and he kept Elizabeth as a virtual prisoner in this house. From her upstairs room, Elizabeth wrote and published poetry and carried on a voluminous correspondence with various people in the arts. Wimpole Street is Elizabeth Barrett's famous address. Robert Browning was from the other side of London, south of the River Thames, in an area destroyed in World War II. Robert Browning had a difficult start in his writing career. He wrote poems and plays that received terrible reviews. The reviews were very discouraging to him. Robert Browning began publishing a series of poems and plays called Bells and Pomegranates. Elizabeth Barrett read his work and wrote about it in one of her own poems. Or, from Browning, some pomegranate, which if cut deep down the middle, shows a heart, blood tinctured of a veined humanity. Browning was overwhelmed by this line, feeling that at last had found someone who understood him and his poetry. He immediately began writing to her and even proposed before they'd ever met. Eventually, he did visit her in her room, where she occasionally received visitors. The letters they sent back and forth are some of the most famous love letters ever written. Eventually, Robert persuaded Elizabeth to marry him. Because of her father, she had to sneak out of the house with the help of one of her sisters and her maid, and fainting several times along the way, she traveled the few blocks to Marylebone Church, where they were married. This is the Brownings' marriage license, which is on display in Marylebone Church. This is the exterior of Marylebone Church in London. In addition to displaying the Brownings' marriage license, the church has a room which it's dedicated to the Brownings to commemorate the fact that they were married in this church. In the Browning room, you will find a stained glass window noting the date of the Brownings' marriage, as well as plaques depicting Elizabeth and Robert Browning. The story is often portrayed as the romantic story of a young girl defying her father to marry her true love. But at the time of the marriage, Elizabeth was 40 years old. Immediately after the wedding ceremony here in Marylebone Church, Elizabeth returned to her house and Robert to his. He began making plans for them to leave London, and several days later they left to live in Italy. I'm sure all of you have heard the famous opening lines of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Sonnet 43. How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. I love thee to the depth, breadth, and height my soul can reach. But the poem The Cry of the Children presents a very different side of the poet, a concern for the political and social issues of her time.
All right, so yeah, the woman needs to. What do you need to still a camera? Anyway, whatever you need to still a camera, she needs one of those things. But I did think it was kind of cool to see some of the sites and hear a little bit more of their story. So yeah, so she's really known for that, and obviously, here we go. So I want to talk now about the Cry of the Children. Importantly, it's published in Blackwoods. We talked a little bit about periodicals in the Romantic era. They continue to have importance in the Victorian era, and I would argue, maybe even today, maybe not quite as much as they did then, but Blackwoods is a really long-running periodical, 1817 to 1980, so that's like after I was born. And it is a weak periodical, so it's going to not be siding with sort of the conservative factions of the government. And so it's important that she publishes this in Blackwoods, and you got to think about this, right, when you think about her target audience, right, because she directly refers to them. Do you hear the cry of the children? My brothers, right? So who's she addressing? Who is she talking to? Who is she hoping will be reading this periodical and might be convinced to do something, right, to help? Well, the issue, the rhetorical situation that she's responding to is, sorry, I've been teaching a lot of English 110, is the 10 hours bill. The 10 hours bill was in 1847, although it took almost 15 years to pass this bill, right? The idea for it was to restrict work by women and working children to 10 hours a day, which, still seems like a really long time to me. But, yeah. And, like I said, it took almost 15 years to pass. One of the things that really encouraged people to pass this bill, part of it was like the pathos, right, in poems like this one, which were really meant to, tug at people's heartstrings. They remind me a lot of like Save the Children commercials, where you just see these children in these dire situations and you feel like you want to do something to change things, right? But another thing that really encouraged people to vote for this change after 15 years was the idea about education and morality, right? And I know Ellie pointed this out in her Flipgrid, referring to the video I posted, but, if children can't get educated, then, that doesn't bode well for their future prospects, and maybe for the nation's future prospects. So the Royal Commission had investigated not only working hours and conditions of the children, but also their moral state. So the Royal Commission, right, found a lot of concern in their habits and their language, which is interesting. But the greatest concern was that the means, and this is a quote, the means of secular and religious instruction are so grievously defective that in all the districts, great numbers of children and young persons are growing up without any religious, moral, or intellectual training. Nothing being done to form them to habits of order, sobriety, honesty, and forethought, or even to restrain them from vice and crime, right? So not giving them an education might lead them to a life of crime, is going to keep them from being orderly and sober, and also they're not getting any religious teaching. And in fact, to Ben's point on his flip, the children don't seem to care about God, because if there were a God, why would he allow them to live this way? Heaven, based on this poem, would be more factories. And this actually reminds me of how Louisa May Alcott, writing in America, wrote about how heaven must be a parlor room with a piano, right? Heaven is what we see. It's very hard to envision something other than what we're used to. And so I think that's a really powerful part of this poem that might really, be rhetorically effective if the target audience is Christians, which most people still were, right? So Michael talked about this a little bit, but Medea in mythology is most known for, after her husband cheated on her, for murdering her children. Here's an 1862 painting by Delacroix of Medea about to murder her children. Yeah, it's It's quite an interesting painting, and I wish I could talk to those of you who know more about art about it. I mean, you see the knife in her hand, but the children are up against her breasts. She's kind of like looking away from them defiantly and out towards what looks like the walls of a cave. So it's a very fascinating painting. Yeah, but I think it's very important that she begins her poem with, "Alas, alas, why do you gaze at me with your eyes, my children?" And it's almost like the gaze of the children is on all of us, or those of us who allow for these conditions to take place. And as a lot of you have remarked, and as I myself tried to sort of point to in the video that I gave you guys to watch, these conditions, still happen. We still have sweatshops. And, not just in less developed countries or the global south, but, even in America, we have a lot of undocumented children doing really horrific things, right? And really being treated as almost non-persons, right? And so I think it's important to be aware of this because it's not like we don't have these things happening today. In terms of formal aspects, I think if I were in class with you, I would definitely want to talk about the rhyme scheme, which really feels kind of simplistic. It's just like a straight A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B, or A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, H, G, H, and so, and it has a pretty clear meter too, which kind of gives it like a ballad feel, maybe. And maybe that's the idea, is that it's supposed to be almost like a song of woe. I'm not really sure. It also gives it more of a sense of innocence. One of you said it reminded you of Blake, and I can totally see that. And maybe that too is just like sort of the simplicity of the words, right? You kind of almost hear their voices, and I think Michael pointed this out. You actually do hear their voices later in the poem, where you hear like their quotes, right? You also have the repetition, the young lambs and the young birds and the young fawns and the young flowers, but the young children. And then in the next stanza, you have the old man, the old tree, the old year, the old wound, the old hope. So you have that definitely that repetition where you have these ideas that are juxtaposed against each other, and the sort of young and the old are the old have had time to live their lives, but these young children have had no time, and not like the young lambs and the young birds who are playing and bleating and chirping. All the young children are doing is crying, right? You begin with a question. Do you hear the children weeping, oh my brothers? The sorrow comes with years. And the next stanza, do you question the young children in the sorrow, why their tears are falling so? And then, you have some narration. They look up with their pale and sunken faces, and their looks are sad to see. And then the next stanza, true, say the children, it may happen that we die before our time. So you're hearing their voices. So we do hear them, right? And then we have the narrator himself or themselves saying, alas, the wretched children, they are seeking death in life as best to have. So now we were asked, do you hear them? We heard them. And now we're hearing sort of the response to them, right? So I think that's very, very powerful and successful. And obviously you have the imagery of nature. You have the birds and the lambs and, a lot of stuff that could be straight from Wordsworth. But then you also have like that stanza where you have the image from the factories, the knees trembling sorely, the wheels are droning and turning and the wind coming into their faces, right? And so that is all like juxtaposed. The black fires, the iron wheels are droning. So that is definitely juxtaposed with the beauty of nature. And like I said, I think it's really interesting to think about, who is the you here? Do you hear the children weeping? Oh, my brothers. Are we talking here about the people who are going to vote for this act? Are we talking about the readers of Blackwoods? I think we could be talking about anybody who either doesn't vote for this or is complacent about it, and allows it to happen and doesn't say anything. So, I wish I were talking to you about this poem. It's really one of my favorite poems, and I love Elizabeth Barrett Browning. But I hope this was useful. I look forward to listening to the rest of your flips and responding to some of them. And I hope you all have a great weekend, and I'll see you in class Monday.